Dan Rucci, welcome to the Ingrid Barclay podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, I just want to say a massive thank you for being here because I know you are always really time poor and kind of run your day hour to hour, appointment by
No
appointment.
problem.
But
We got
look,
there.
it's really great to have you here.
We got
Yeah,
there in the
so
end.
you are finally, you're a powerlifting club and events venue director. You are a powerlifting coach, and you're a remedial therapist, husband to
hmm
Heidi, and new father to Ronnie.
Thank you.
Congratulations. And here you are, and I get to pick your brain for a little
Of
while.
course.
So, look, I'll just ask you a couple of very general introduction questions, but then I'm just going to get right into it.
Yeah.
All right. So, um, look, a lot of my followers on Figure It Out, they're fairly new to resistance training. Not all of them. Some of them are actually quite experienced, and a few of them are now dabbling in powerlifting, and some are certainly thinking
hmm
about it. So it will be largely along powerlifting lines, I guess, that I ask questions. But I got to at least ask you one curly question along the way. Anyway,
Ask me anything you want.
look, how long have you actually been involved in powerlifting
Oh,
for
good
now, Dan?
question. Big ones. Actually, not that difficult. I think I first competed in 2010. So I guess since the start of, the start of the journey for us in terms of powerlifting was probably then. So it's 10 years now. Obviously, a couple of years before that, we were still strength training and sort of working ourselves up to competing in powerlifting. So it's, yeah, about a decade. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And what is it that not only drew you to powerlifting, but has obviously kept you in the thick of it for 10 years? And I mean, you're going from strength to strength. So, what is it about the sport for you?
Well, look, obviously, Paul and I, we have an athletic background, so we played lots of soccer, and that kind of led into other things later in life where we started looking at resistance training. And when you start training, a lot of people sort of look at bodybuilding, right? Obviously, that's sort of where everyone starts. It just
Yep.
wasn't for us because we've always been performance based types of people, sporting performance rather than sort of physique related stuff, you know. And I guess one thing led to another. We found the sport of powerlifting. Obviously, there's a few steps sort of before that happened, but to keep a long story very short, I guess what happened was we competed in our first meet in 2010, and what we loved about it was the camaraderie that the sport offers. You know, the whole premise that it's an individual sport. You know, it's a team sport played by individuals, whereas you're on the platform by yourself, but you need a whole bunch of people to support you to make it happen. And just the camaraderie between the lifters, you know, I mean, that's really what drew us to the sport. The sort of the support that you had around you while you were competing, even if it is an individual sport, you still had that support. And we even experienced that in training. You know, so we started in our garage. We had a few guys come over to train, and even in training, you find that support system there, which is really cool. Which kind of, from my experience, and you'd probably be able to contest to this a little bit more. It doesn't really happen in bodybuilding. Everyone's got their headphones on, they're zoned in, they're just doing their own thing. It's not really a team-based style of training, you know. Whereas with powerlifting, you know, if
No.
we're doing heavy squats, you need a whole bunch of guys around you spotting, loading, knee wrapping, back slapping, all that kind of stuff that goes on, which kind of doesn't happen in bodybuilding. So to be honest, that's kind of what drew us to the sport of powerlifting. The other thing was it's a fantastic mechanism to keep you motivated and setting yourself goals and retesting, just because you can see that progress, right? And I guess the other thing we love about powerlifting is it's very objective. You know whether you're getting stronger or not. With bodybuilding, it depends who the judge is,
Yeah.
what they're after, the criteria, you know, who's sleeping with who, that type of thing, right? Well, from my experience, not that I have a lot of experience in bodybuilding, but from
Yeah.
what people tell me, you know. Whereas in powerlifting, you squat 300
Yeah.
or you don't. End of story. And so the
Yeah.
objectivity is another thing that drew us to the sport. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's certainly not that I ever personally had any issues with the politics. I mean, I was in the thick of my federation,
Mm.
not only being a competitor, but also a judge, and I was involved in writing for that federation in magazines. And,
Yeah.
I guess I was on a good wicket, so to speak, but I totally get the subjectivity, and that for me personally, what was so invigorating and refreshing about moving into powerlifting was the white lights or the red lights.
That's right. It's black and white. Sure, we have the
Yeah,
whole, but that was high. That was, you know what I mean. You have your good and bad calls. We have an objective rule book that's applied subjectively. So, people make mistakes. Sometimes you don't have referees that are experienced enough. But at the end of the day, hi Paul, it's white lights or red lights. End of story. You
yeah,
know.
yeah. And I think it would be fair to say, even like I've only been involved in it for 4 years, and I reckon at least in the last 3 years, I would say that powerlifting is really enjoying an explosion in popularity at the moment. Why do you think that is?
One of my favorite topics to talk about, to be honest. I guess to
Uh-huh.
understand why, you need to understand where the sport has come from. So if you go
Mm-hmm.
back, say, 20 or 30 years in the sport of powerlifting, we didn't have raw powerlifting. Everything was in equipment, squat suits, bench shirts, deadlift suits. It was very, very difficult. The barrier to entry is very high. Not only do you have to have a huge amount of strength and technical ability to use the equipment, it's expensive. You need lots of people around you. The barrier to entry is just way too high for general population. Fast
Right.
forward to, say, the last decade, once raw powerlifting was introduced as an actual sport, where the IPF adopted classic raw, and then the other federations followed suit. So now in the GPC we have a raw division. We are allowed to use a knee wrap, and you have similar types of raw divisions, whether you call it classic raw or raw plus. People call it different things, but essentially it means the use we're not allowed to use that supportive equipment, which brings the barrier to entry down because you can just perform a squat, no knee sleeves, no belt, nothing. You can just perform a bench press, no bench shirt. You can deadlift, no deadlift suit. The barrier to entry is very low. Couple that with the improvement in coaching and the availability of coaching, and the ridiculous, really, improvement of available facilities. When we first started, we only had sort of the muscle pit in Cannington, way too far from where Paul and I lived. Um, and it is what it is. Not everyone's prepared to travel more than 30 or 40 minutes to get to a gym, and so we sort of gap in the market, I guess. And so we started our own gym, and it's just sort of exploded from there. And I guess our philosophy with the gym itself is to have a gym that eventually would evolve into a modern facility that is big, has plenty of equipment. We're able to run the meets to the highest level and be able to support a huge amount of lifters. That was very important to us because you can't grow the sport without having the capacity. It's as simple as that. You can't run a meet in a 100 square meter gym. It's just not going to happen. I mean, the meets we have here, 120 lifters over a weekend. And to make that happen, you need a huge amount of room. You need equipment. You need staff, officials, space. And so it's taken us 8 years to get to where we are now.
Hmm.
And who knows where we're going to be in another 8 years? I have no idea. If you were to tell me we were where we are now 8 years ago, I would have said you're dreaming. But it is what it is. But that's kind of how it's led to where we are now. Yeah. What was the original question? I don't remember. Oh, the question was how in the last 3 years the explosion of powerlifting, right? I think if you
And
couple all those
why?
factors,
Why?
right? I think if you couple all those factors, they're huge reasons. The other one is many of us market the sport really well as a mechanism for general population to come in, have some fun, and so we have novice competitions which bring the barrier to entry down. There's no federation membership. You don't have to wear a soft suit. The soft suit's a big one for people, right? They're scared to put the leotard on. So they can wear shorts and a t-shirt. They can just have some fun on the platform, experience what the sport would be like if they were to actually take it up and opt in down the track. And once you get those people on the platform, it's so easy. It's like, you know, It's like fishing frenzy, right? Because they have an amazing experience, and that's what it's all about, is giving people an experience that makes them want to come back and experience more of the sport and progress. I think that's why we have this explosion in powerlifting now. It's just due to the quality of the events, coaching, facilities, availability of all that as well. In Australia, we have many gyms in Australia who do a great job. And there's, no one, we're not sport for choice. There's choices everywhere, which is fantastic, because Paul and I are definitely pro-choice when it comes to powerlifting, whether what federation you want to lift in, or gym, or style, or whatever the case may be. But I think the growth has come from pushing general population into the sport, which has been important. And you're finding that yourself now with your clients, who are starting to ask you questions about powerlifting, and starting to dabble themselves, and even just to adopt the style of training that we do. And then, you've got clients now that are probably looking to get on the platform because they see you do it. You're a role model for your own clients. So naturally they want to follow in your footsteps, in a sense. Yeah,
Mm.
I think though that they're the main reasons. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So let's jump right into some valuable tips for all the listeners who do any kind of weight training, whether it's powerlifting, bodybuilding, CrossFit, recreational weightlifting. Can we take each of the three lifts, the squat, bench, and deadlift? And can you talk through the
Hmm.
top common errors that you see in each? And
Errors.
then perhaps, yeah,
Yeah.
errors. And then perhaps give some guidelines to these newies on how to fix those errors. Just the top ones. I know there's a
Whew,
list a mile
okay.
long, but
Look, I guess before you get to that, you have to understand that in powerlifting, we use those three lifts. They're events for us, right? They're not exercises, they're events. And if you go and look at any sport, say look at track and field, javelin, shot put, whatever the case may be, swimming, they're events. And so what that means is the athletes and the coaches obviously spend a huge amount of time trying to develop the technical ability of the athlete for those particular events. So in the same as powerlifting, and this is where it's a little bit grey with powerlifting, because in bodybuilding, in CrossFit, in pick another strength discipline or training, they should be squatting, benching, and deadlifting. Maybe apart from weightlifting, where they wouldn't do a horizontal press, right? Although in powerlifting, because our aim is to move as much weight as possible, we have to be technically refined on those three lifts and be highly skilled. And so that can take a little bit of time. So I guess initially my advice would be to beginners is just be patient with the three lifts, because it does take some time to develop them and build that skill base that's going to support and facilitate long-term growth. And that's where people really fuck up, to be honest. Excuse my language, but it's really where they make mistakes, because
all good.
they rush the process, and I hate the phrase, trust the process. But the fact is, it is true. People try and rush the process. They try and add weight to the bar too early, and all they're doing is reinforcing bad movement, because they're not able to move very well. And that eventually will lead to injury or plateauing of progress, because their ceiling hasn't got any higher, because they haven't been able to build a solid technical base. That's initially what I want to say to someone who's beginning. Look, outside of that, if you have access to a coach, yourself, Ingrid, obviously, we have coaching services. We coach a huge team of powerlifters. There are other coaches in the country. If you have access to one, obviously that can be beneficial, because it can fast track your development as well. So
Mm,
that's what I would say, is if you're really serious about it, and you have access to a coach, and everyone does, because there's online coaches everywhere. I mean, Paul and I coach lifters. I mean, you're in Victoria, I coach you. I've got a couple more over there. We've got some internationals. So you can be coached from anywhere. Um, I guess when we look at the three lifts themselves, in terms of the squat, common faults. Uh, a lot of the faults are really related to preparation and how people move throughout the range. Um, and Paul and I are big on this. 80% of your effort should be spent on preparation, correctly breathing and bracing your trunk to maintain a nice, stable, rigid trunk position, a nice tight position, because that facilitates a safe pattern, and an efficient transfer of force, right? I guess in terms of the squat, the biggest one we see with beginners is the loss of hip stability, which will result in your knees caving inwards, that valgus of the knees. And that's really just smoke from the fire. The knees caving in is a result of you losing hip stability, all right? So that's probably the biggest area that we see in terms of beginners where they go wrong initially is really just the loss of hip stability, which is really just a weakness throughout the glute complex. I would spend lots of time on trying to correct those positions, and a lot of coaches will use, the cues knees out, that type of cue. Knees out actually,
Mhm.
unless your lifter knows what you're talking about, is actually a really bad cue for a beginner, because knees out means to a beginner, push them out as far as you can go, right? So that would even include pushing them out so far where your knees would align outside of your toe range, if that makes sense, where they are
Yeah.
valising outwards. Outside of that's also not good. What really the cue should be is not knees in. And what I mean by that is if you can start with your knee tracking over your second and third toes so you can maintain a good position, you do not want your knees to cave inwards from there, not knees
Right.
in. Right? Does that make sense?
Okay.
And so the knee position is as a result of the hip stability is the most important thing, because that's what really stops people's progress a lot. Because what happens is when your body moves through a range, it is going to try and find the path of least resistance. And if you don't have good hip stability, your knees will valgus, and then they'll valgus in so hard. Once that resistance is found, then energy will start being transferred through your lower torso to your upper torso through to the bar. The problem with that is it's really inefficient, and not to mention mechanically unsound. So you can end up with a whole bunch of issues, glute, knee issues, ankle issues. So that's probably the most important one with the squat. We
Okay.
even see
Yeah.
this with, we see this with advanced lifters as well. This is not just isolated to beginners. We are all going to
I
suffer with
believe I
weakness.
might be one of them.
Yeah, we all have shit going on. Even I sometimes when it gets heavy, struggle sometimes to keep my knees in position. Although I have found if I go back say 10 years and look at my squat videos, I'm a hell of a lot better now than I was back then. Because I've had 10 years
Mm.
of solid foundation training and technical work. So obviously my technical ability is very good. And this is where beginners, someone's been lifting for 3 weeks, they think they're going to squat 300 kilos, it kind of doesn't work that way. If it did, we'd all be squatting 1,000 kilos. um, the best, I'll stick to sort of one main one with each lift, all right? So that's sort of the
Sure.
main
Yeah.
one with the squat, I feel. The
Yeah.
bench press, look, the bench press is a little bit different from the other two because it's very alien. It's certainly not a position that as human beings we find ourselves in often, especially lying down, unless you're in bed doing some funky shit. But in terms of a horizontal press, if you think about a horizontal press, pushing someone or fighting someone, grappling, that type of thing sort of makes sense. But generally, for human beings, we don't have the need for any sort of strong horizontal press, especially laying down. So it's a very, very awkward movement. And so when beginners start bench pressing, you'll find it's really uncoordinated. They just don't have the coordination. Um, we refer to the bench press as a pseudo closed kinetic chain movement. And what I mean by that is if you consider the squat and the deadlift, it's a true closed kinetic chain pattern because we're grounded to the floor, right? In the
Yeah.
bench press, we're not. We're laying down, and we can literally have our feet in the air if we want, which is certainly not. It's more of an open chain movement than a closed kinetic chain movement. But we ground our feet to the floor as tight as we can and try and maintain a nice connection with the ground to try and simulate a closed kinetic chain movement. So it's a little bit different from the other two. In terms of the common faults with the bench press, the first one is just position. Most people won't try and put themselves into a nice, what we would refer to as a globally extended position, where their spine is extended all the way through their spine. Their pelvis is in a nice anterior pelvic tilt, so you're rolling forward, which helps facilitate a nicer position. They'll just flat back it, for example, right? Um,
Hmm.
and that's not really great, especially through your thoracic spine. So your thoracic spine is where where your ribs attach to. Okay. Um, and the important part with the thoracic spine is if you don't extend the spine, so if you don't actually push it forward, you're not providing enough space for your scapula to get into the right position so that they are nice and stable to help facilitate a nice range of motion through the shoulder joint, through that glenohumeral joint. So the retraction and depression of your scapula, which actually is a downward rotation, is a very important position to be in the bench press so that you have a nice stable upper back. All right? Because when you press, all that force is being directed straight back perpendicular to that line, basically that line, through your shoulder blades to the bench. So that connection with the bench is really important. And you've heard me say this before. It's the whole you can't shoot a cannon off a canoe analogy, right? Where you
Yeah.
want your upper back connection with the bench to be like a battleship, so that when you start delivering force or pressing that bar, that energy is transferred straight back to the bar rather than being lost in instability through your upper back connection with the bench. So that's a really important position to be in. Sorry if people
Yeah.
listening to this are a little bit confused. But if you were to search for sort of upper back position on the bench press, or even if you want to get in touch with Ingrid or myself, I'm happy to explain it a bit more. But your
Look,
scapula or your shoulder blades should be retracted and depressed, and that's the position they should stay in the whole time. They should be nice and tight, and you'll see this when you watch someone bench press when they squeeze the chest up to the bar and it effectively shorten the length of their arms by pulling their shoulder blades back. And that's a really good position to be
yeah.
in. That's probably the biggest part of the bench press. Initially, I will suggest that beginners focus on.
Dan, just before you go into the deadlift hot tip, just after listening to all of that on the bench, one of the things I often see in bench articles in bodybuilding forums and such like T Nation is that the arch isn't necessary, as bodybuilders aren't actually after a shorter range of motion. What's your opinion? If you do bodybuilding or you just recreationally train,
Yeah.
should you put yourself in that powerlifting bench position, or should you just plop yourself down on the bench any old how?
Yeah, great question. I guess if you go back and try and understand the intent of what we're trying to accomplish in bodybuilding and powerlifting, it helps you understand the reasons, right? In powerlifting, we position ourselves whereby we gain a mechanical advantage over the bar, right? And that would include shortening your range of motion, improving leverage, right? In bodybuilding, the end goal is to grow your muscle belly. That's what bodybuilding is, right? And so, in order to do that, you need to put those muscles under the most demand, the most stress you can, which means taking them through a bigger and more fuller range of motion and having more time under tension. So, if you can sort of get your head around that, it helps you understand the difference between the two disciplines and then how you would train for each discipline. So, for example, if you were using a bench press in bodybuilding, you probably wouldn't use a crazy ass arch. You would definitely try and have a nice thoracic position so that you can get your shoulder blades in the right position. And that's really only to facilitate longevity and healthy lifting. Otherwise, you're just going to destroy your shoulders. But in
Mm-hmm.
bodybuilding, the goal should be to take your pec through the biggest range of motion you can, right? So I would probably minimize how much someone arch their entire back, for example. That would be an important
Okay.
part in bodybuilding, yeah.
I think that's really important for some of the listeners because they would be a bit uncertain of how to place themselves down after listening to that. Like, oh,
Yeah,
which way
yeah,
do I
yeah.
go?
Now look,
Yeah.
it's funny because you see, you've seen it. You'll see like some little 16-year-old Russian girl bench with this huge arch and the bar moves like this much, and you have all these comments like, "That's not a bench press," and there's people just flaming her, right? But what they don't understand
Yeah.
is that's powerlifting. She's executing the lift in within the sporting regulation, the rule book, and as long as you do that, you get white lights, and that's all that matters. There's a huge misconception, right? Powerlifting is not about finding who the strongest person is, right? It's about finding who
Yep.
can move the most weight within the confinements of our rule book. And if that means that someone can have a range of motion in their bench because they've got ridiculous ability to put themselves in position and have a little range of motion where they're literally doing that, you know what? Good luck to them. I mean, that's what powerlifting is.
Yeah.
She's not trying to be a bodybuilder. She's not trying to impress some bro at the local, YMCA. She don't give a shit.
Yeah.
All she cares about is a 60-kilo girl benched 120 kilos. Because on the score sheet, that's all it says. It doesn't say what her range of motion was. And that's where the misconception is, and then that's a bit where the hate comes from as well. It's like kind of like sumo, right? When people they'll watch Wright, for example, pull 382 like he did here a couple of weeks ago, and then in the comments you see some shit like, "Oh yeah, it's good, but it's not impressive because it's sumo." It's like, dude, like, you know.
Yeah.
And I think if you understand why you're training, so if you're trying to get a better physique, then understanding how you execute your training and the intent of the training is very important. And I think what happens is sometimes people try and replicate what we do in powerlifting when really they probably shouldn't, because it's not why they're training. They're training maybe to look better. and grow and hypertrophy and bigger muscle bellies and get leaner. So doing a powerlifting bench press may not be the way for them to go entirely. Anyway, they should
Yeah.
definitely use a few of the technicals of the lift, only for health reasons, obviously to maintain shoulder health. But again, I wouldn't probably put them in a huge arch like a crazy one, like some
Yeah.
of the stuff that we do. Yeah.
Yeah. And finally, the Deddy. Deddy.
Okay.
What's the common
Deadlift is an absolute,
term
yeah,
there?
absolute no-brainer. There's an absolute no-brainer with a deadlift, and you've all seen this before. You'll see a video on on social media, and there'll be someone deadlifting, and they look like a dog having a shit, right? You know what I mean? Um, the biggest, the biggest technical fault that new people have with deadlifting is not being able to maintain a neutral back position. All right. And what I mean by that is if, everyone's seen, the skeleton and what the neutral back position looks like, where you have this nice curvature of the spine, right? Everyone knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
If you go to Google and search, you'll see what I mean. The spine has a natural curvature, okay? Unfortunately, in the deadlift, it's actually the easiest lift to cheat. And what I mean by that is your body will manipulate joint angles in order for it to gain leverage so that it moves the weight off the floor. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, that it's good for you. So when you see lifters lifting big weight, even beginners with lightweight because they're just not strong enough, and you see their back coming into complete flexion, like if you were to get, like a fishing rod, how a fishing rod bends, where it's flexion,
Yep.
that's not how you want to be performing your deadlift, because you're putting yourself in a position where it's high risk, because you can get injured. Unfortunately, when you've got new lifters, especially young lifters who don't understand what pain feels like, they're very cavalier in training sometimes, and they take a lot of risks in training, and a lot of them get injured. They do. See it all the time,
Mm.
and it's really borderline annoying because they should know better. And with the coaching that's available these days and the stuff that we know, it really annoys me when people lift like that and they get hurt, because it could have been completely avoided. So for the deadlift, it's about maintaining a nice neutral back position. Okay. Now look, there's going to be there's a bit of contention on this. Neutral is certainly not a fixed position. Some people will say that even if you are in slight flexion, as long as you maintain that throughout the lift, that's okay. I'm okay with that to a point. All right. Neutral is definitely not one sort of position. It's a range, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So you are allowed to sort of take a little bit of tension out of the back, but you certainly wouldn't put yourself in a position where each segment of your spine was literally hanging or hinging off the ligaments, where you weren't getting supported by the muscles that are supposed to support your back, right? Now, in terms of the common fault that would sort of, for all three lifts, it's breathing and bracing. Learning how to breathe and get as much air into the belly as possible, and then bracing around that to create intra-abdominal pressure, which helps you maintain a good postural position and rigidity through your trunk. That's probably the area that people, for all three lifts, that's where they mess up the most.
Well, Dan, funny you mentioned that, because it was my very next question was breathing and bracing. Can you talk us through it? Because you always tell me that that's the crux of a good lift, and yet it's really difficult. And even I say to my clients, I don't think I've nailed this breathing and bracing perfectly, certainly not in every rep.
Yeah.
And this is a personal opinion, but I think this stems from the average PT going through Cert 4, and I'll say we, because this is what I got taught, 30 odd years ago, is that when you do a concentric, you breathe out, and when you do the eccentric, you breathe in. And
Yeah. Okay.
what I will say, Dan, with the breathing and bracing, obviously you have me and all of your clients practicing this every rep. I can tell you right now that when I do it, particularly for me on a bench press, and I've nailed the breathing and bracing, oh my God, does that make a difference? And the bar just flies up and it's effortless. But it's
Exactly.
really hard to replicate. It's really hard to replicate rep after rep after rep.
Yeah.
So Any good tips for how the newie can kind of get their head around this breathing and bracing?
Yeah. What I will say initially is, again, if you go back to the three lifts and change the mindset a little bit, they're a skill. It's an event. It's not an exercise. It's an event, right? So you want to get really, really good at it. And so the only way to get good at something, and we've all heard this before, right? Repetition is the mother of skill, right? Perfect
Yeah.
practice, practice makes perfect, but really perfect practice makes perfect. Because if you practice something incorrectly, you're just going to get really good at doing something really shit. And that's definitely the case. And that's definitely the case with these three lifts. Often we see people just going through the motions, just like, oh, it's a set of 10 today, it's really light, and they're not thinking about the exercise as an event, as a skill, and they're just going through the motions, right? So and this is something, I'll pick you up. Paul and I are big on this, and Elliot were big on this. Every repetition you do in training is an opportunity to practice and refine. Because at the end of the day, your lifting and the quality of your lifting, especially expressed on the platform, is going to be an average of the time you spend in training, if that makes sense. So if the average of your
Hmm.
time in spending, if the average time of the time you spend in training is bad quality, then you're probably not going to be a great lifter. Whereas if you actually spend the time in training to really try and perfect each single rep and try and practice that process each time, then more times than not, you're going to be able to hit the perfect rep. And so I guess the goal is you want to improve the chances of you hitting that perfect rep. So out of 100 reps, for example, like a beginner might start with 0. They can't hit a perfect rep. They get to the point where they can hit 5 out of 100. Then after a year, they're hitting 20 out of 100. You want to get to the point where you'd be considered highly skilled, where 90% or more of your lifts, reps, are as close to perfect as possible. Perfect, technically sound, right? That's where you want to get to, because on the platform, you only get one chance. You only get one chance on the platform. You can't say, "Oh, hang on a second, man, like that didn't go well. Can we put?" You don't get a chance, right? And so executing the lifts over and over again to the best of your ability and refining is a very important part of the process. And even if you have a coach, the coach isn't always going to be with you 100% of the time to watch each rep and give you feedback on each rep. It's too slow. It's not viable. It's impossible, right? So as a lifter, you have to
Yeah.
get to the point where you're able to, even between each rep, so intra rep, take a split second and think, did it feel good or bad? If it felt bad, why? Fix it on the next rep. If it felt good, keep replicating that over and over again throughout the whole set. And that's how you get good at something. And we call that refinement. We would refer to that as the refinement stage of skill acquisition, right? That's really important. And so I would make sure that in
Hmm.
training, you're trying to execute things the same over and over again. So even if you're doing something really light, so even at 50%, use it as an opportunity to practice. Divert your intensity from weight on the bar to skill, if that makes sense. So spend your mental
Hmm.
energy focusing on execution rather than, holy fuck, I've got to move this weight. Does that make sense? Because when you get to that point where it's 90% plus, you have to be able to fall back on your technique because you ain't got time to think about it. You're worried about moving this heavy ass weight. And so by refining and building that skill base in your training, when you get to the heavier stuff, you need to fall back on that. And that's really important,
Hmm.
right? And that's really, to be honest, in our opinion, what separates a beginner or an intermediate lifter from what we would consider elite. In powerlifting, we have grading scales. If you hit a certain total, you're elite. To us, that doesn't really define an elite lifter. Because I've seen people walk
Hmm.
off the street and they're just inherently strong, and on their first comp, they total an elite total. To us, that's not elite. Elite means someone who's able to execute these lifts with almost precision perfection over and over again, consistently over a long, long, long period of time, right? That's someone to us, who is
Hmm.
elite. So what that means is, even if you don't have an elite total, you can still be an elite lifter because you're so good at it.
Right.
I mean,
That's that's actually a really interesting take on the definition of elite.
yeah. I mean, it's
Yeah.
the same old story, right? Just because you're strong, that means you know what you're doing. Not necessarily. And the same
No.
old story goes. Just because someone's strong, it doesn't mean they're going to be a good coach. The two don't
Yeah.
go hand in hand. And that's kind of the biggest thing that's one of our biggest philosophies, really, is that whole
Well,
proponent
it's
of
it's
skill
the same thing
acquisition.
in
Yeah.
it's the same thing in bodybuilding, Dan. I mean, big boys are a dime a dozen.
Yeah.
half of them don't even know how they got there, let alone have the capability to coach somebody.
Which actually is
You
okay.
know,
It's an
so
okay thing, right? Because some people have the genetics, some people know how to fucking train hard, right? I've seen people like who have genetics, but they just don't understand how to train with intensity. And then you've got some people who don't have the genetics that understand how to train with intensity, understand how to eat, and those are the ones that make a lot of progress. Um, you know,
yeah,
time is the biggest equalizer. So if you get two people, one with blessed genetics, one with average genetics, you give them both the same program. The guy with the awesome genetics doesn't really apply himself. The guy with average genetics applies himself. In 10 years' time, I would put my bottom dollar on it that the average guy will be better lifter.
yeah, yeah. Interesting. All right.
Did that
Um,
answer the question?
moving. Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's great. um, a couple of my questions, I'm going to draw a little bit from my experience coaching with you because I think I might be have been under you for maybe nearly 2 years now.
I could tell you
Um,
exactly if you want. But it's about 2 years.
yeah. Um, I've noticed in my blocks over the couple of years that most often you'll give me a heavy squat day and then a squat variation on a separate day. And I think that
Hmm.
some of the listeners might find that interesting. And would you care to explain what the purpose of the squat variation is?
Yeah. So normally we would typically, right? We would have a specific squat day where we're training your competition squat. So you'll have your competition squat, whether that be if we're sort of 5 to 8 weeks out of competition, you might be in a knee wrap, for example. Use that as an example, right? Um, but squatting once a week really isn't enough. So what we do is we will introduce a squat variation on another day of training to help just introduce some more training load and perhaps a different type of stimulus that we feel you need. So for example, with you, Ingrid, I know I've tried front squats with you, but you don't like front squats, do you? You just
No,
can't get there, right? And that's fine. The shoulder mobility is not there. But we can use a safety bar, for example. I know you don't have. Do you have a safety bar? I can't remember. Yeah, we've been using
yeah,
the safety bar, haven't
yeah,
we? And so
yeah.
the safety bar, for example, is a fantastic variation because it gives us an opportunity to add load to your lower torso and obviously your upper torso, but we can take demand off your shoulders, which means we can push your bench a bit more. Because if we're squatting you low bar 2 or 3 times a week, your shoulders are going to get absolutely annihilated, and your elbows, right? Your elbows
I don't know about the shoulders, but those elbows won't hold up.
The elbows is a result of the shoulder demand on the shoulders, right?
Yeah,
Elbows get annihilated because of the demand on the shoulders, and also the shoulders can get beat up depending on the lifter. And so what that means is you can't bench press. So it's kind of like robbing from Peter to give to Paul. So it doesn't make sense to do that. So we're a big proponent of not doing that. We're not going to give you something in training to help one lift if it's at the detriment of another. To us, that makes zero sense.
yeah,
Not to mention, by adding a squat variation, we can introduce a different stimulus that will support the things we're trying to accomplish with you as a lifter. So, for example, you've always struggled a bit with back position, right? Folding over a
yeah,
bit, back position, which is pretty common as things get heavy, right? So, something like a front squat, which you hate, but let's use the front squat as an example, is a fantastic variation to use because it's very anterior dominant, which means we're going to be challenging your ability to maintain a good upright torso position, which then transfers very well over to your competition squat because you're going to be better at it. So using a
yeah,
variation is not just about adding load, it's also about adding stimulus that helps us accomplish something else we're trying to achieve, which in that position, in your scenario, was back position, thoracic position, that type of thing, right? Um,
and I think yeah, I think that will be helpful for some of the listeners as well because they're going to have, some people are going to have the same problems that I have.
it's very common.
Yeah,
Look,
yeah,
and beginners can normally, squat 3 times a week because the weights are very low, the load's low, and so, but a lot of that's just really just skill stuff. It's very,
yeah,
if I've got a guy squatting 60 kilos, even if it might be heavy for him, it's really just skill acquisition. We're teaching this guy how to squat. Um, as
Yeah.
you get more advanced and advanced in terms of loads, training loads, we do have to start thinking about the stimulus and how it's going to affect your body. And sometimes we don't know. It's a bit of like, I give you something and we've experienced this, and you're like, Dad, that shit ain't working. My elbows are fucked. Or this is, we have to change it, right? And that's going to be different for everyone. And that's really part of the coaching process. Correct
Yeah.
exercise selection based on factors like how it's affecting the lifter. Can they actually perform the lift? Is it at the detriment of another lift? Do they actually need more stimulus? Um, those types of things. We love having a squat variation, and most people will, because again, it allows you to work on things outside of the normal competition squat. And something like a safety bar squat's great for taking demand off the shoulders and elbows. Yeah. Not to mention, we love the front
Great.
squat in particular because the front squat has what we feel a really awesome carryover to your conventional deadlift. Because off the
Okay.
floor, the conventional deadlift is a huge amount of leg drive. And so a front squat
Yes.
kind of mimics that in a way because your foot position is very, very similar, very close.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
because the front squat is very anterior dominant, that means there's a lot of knee travel. It's very quad dominant compared to, say, a low bar back squat, which is very glute complex dominant, right? Because the hip's moving further away from the bar path. And so it allows us also to work on quad strength, which is really important for the conventional deadlift off the floor. Yeah. So there's,
So that's a great tip for those that want to improve their deadlift and they are comfortable with the front squat is perhaps,
yeah.
work that
Oh,
front squat.
if you can front squat, do it. It's got to be
There you go.
one of the best variations. And look, you'll
Awesome.
see lots of coaches, and especially coaches who are new or trying to impress the world. They'll use all these bullshit training exercises to try and like impress people. But the reality is, the basics is really all we need. We don't need
Yeah.
ridiculous variations and just we don't need all that shit. Simple always works. It always has. Master the basics, you'll get stronger. End of story.
That's been one of my philosophies, even with the bodybuilding, is don't invent the wheel.
No,
It's just the
I know.
the squats, the rows, the curls, the presses.
Yeah, yeah. No, in some respect, the philosophy is the same in powerlifting, right? Master the basics. And the problem is people
Yeah.
that don't master the basics, that try and get too tricky with training, they end up either getting injured or plateauing, and they wonder why they're not making progress because they don't know how to do simple shit like a hip hinge or a deep knee bend or a horizontal press. Simple stuff that really you need to master before you start to, advance the lifting. Um,
Yeah.
Master the basics.
Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Um, I must say, I mean, look, there's probably a reason why people do things, but I got to say, it really irks me when I see things like, you know, just before COVID hit over at Deramit's, my local gym, every girl on the planet was doing curtsy squats and every girl on the planet was walking on the stepper sideways. And I'm just like,
No.
man, just stick with the basics.
Yeah, it's crazy. Look, and you know what? They're exercising, which is fantastic.
And
But
that's what I
unfortunately,
go. I go, well, they're doing something, but yeah, yeah,
unfortunately, we live in a social media world, right? Where people who shouldn't have an opinion have one and get heard.
yeah,
And there's lots of
yeah,
really awesome coaches and people with a lot of knowledge that don't have the same following, and so they don't get heard, even though their content and what they know is remarkable. Um, so
yeah,
the
yeah.
social
That's
media, in a way, has helped propagate this nonsense. you know,
mm,
someone sees someone with 1 million followers do some stupid shit with a band. Next minute, everyone in the gym is doing this stupid shit.
absolutely, yeah,
You know.
yeah. One of someone who I think is an absolute guru, like he's right up there with Charles Poliquin, and he doesn't have many followers at all. And yet his qualifications and his employment history. His name's Will Brink.
Hmm.
He's just incredibly phenomenal, but for whatever reason doesn't have that social media following. And I think,
Yeah.
man, more people should listen to this guy. But that's social media and
Yeah.
marketing for you.
He's not sexy enough.
That's
Tell him to
the
start doing his
one.
training naked. He's got to be doing the kickbacks with a G-string on or something. He gets some followers. Look,
Now, I'm going to
again
ask.
though, even in terms of that, I think time is the biggest equalizer. So if someone was to stay as a coach, like this particular guy, for a long period of time, eventually, things come out in the wash. People are going to learn about him, and slowly he'll develop a following. And all those other
He's
idiots
been a,
get washed away, right?
he's been around for 40 years.
He needs some help.
You know,
Yeah,
and I
look, it
mean,
is what it is.
he's trained the Navy SEALs over in the US, and he's done some phenomenal stuff. And that just, yeah,
Yeah.
the following, yeah.
I bet at
but
the same time, maybe he doesn't care.
but
You know.
he does have
Um,
a tribe. It's just a small tribe. That's all.
yeah.
Um, Now, the next question, you're actually not allowed to roll your eyes. It had to come, and this is I guess I'm sharing a big thing about me. And actually, I had a couple of my clients. They wanted me to ask you.
Oh fuck.
um, they wanted to ask you, a couple of things about me, and I said I'm not going there, but I do know that a couple of my followers, they really wanted me to ask this, so I'll ask it straight from the horse's mouth. But you'll have a giggle because it's Ingrid to a T as well. Now, the mindset of every lifter is recognizably going to be very different. Let's talk about me. I'm very much someone that wants to be pushing heavy weight, and I try to PB often. In fact, I've spent years deadlifting, for example, once a week, and every week trying to add weight or reps to the bar. Now, my question is, why do you get your clients so often doing things like undulating programs, and you might be working at like 70% and you're doing 5 sets of 5, which quite frankly feels bloody easy. And I'm like, oh, why am I
Yeah.
doing this? Um, in fact, you said in some feedback the other day, you can't go like a bull at a gate all the time. And there's going to be people out there that go, but why? So,
It's a good question.
how,
When we're
how,
talking
how
about
does
powerlifting, I
work?
guess. Sorry.
Yeah,
Continue.
how does that 5x5s at medium weight type thing? How does that ensure a PB on the platform?
You're thinking about the 5x5 at 70% as a 100% strength focused session. The 5x5 at 70%, as an example, is still quite heavy. And even at 5x5 at 70%, there is a decent amount of stimulus. I think you're undervaluing the value of the lower percentages. You don't always have to be going 80%, 90% in order to get benefit. That's the first thing I'll say. Just because it feels easy, it could still be quite heavy. Forget the percentage. If you might still have 150 kilos on your back, for example. It's not fucking light. It really isn't. You're missing the skill component. You're missing the opportunity to practice and refine and develop your skill base, because that's going to help express and raise your ceiling so that you can express more weight in the future. That's really what some of that stuff's about. And also, you need to undulate your stress in training. We can't have someone, if we were just to say measure stress from 0 to 100%, we can't have someone working at 100% stress all the time, because they're just going to break, get sick. It just doesn't work. So
Yeah,
undulating stress is very important. We're going to have periods of very high stress where we place a lot of demand on you, and there's going to be periods of low stress where we want you to recover and focus on other areas of your training. Skill is a big one, right? And so I think this is one of those things where people don't understand why I'm not always working at 100%. Why has Dan always got me doing like sets of whatever, and it's always like at 6, at 7 RPE where I've got 3 or 4 reps left in the tank? And that's really designed to help keep you fresh, because over the course of a whole training block, say that's 6 weeks long, we are slowly incrementing your training load most of the time, especially if we're just talking about general prep. Forget about competition preparation for the time being. In a general prep phase, say that's 6 weeks long, there is a slow and steady accumulation of load slash stress throughout the training block. And so what happens is over the 6 weeks, you have this accumulation of stress. So at the end of the 6 weeks, more likely than not, you'll probably feel like you need a little bit of a reeling in of the percentages and the load. Okay, so people
Yeah.
think too micro. They think one session. You need to think 6 weeks or a whole training block. At the end of the training block, think about the total load. Think about the total amount of stress. That's the important part. One training session in the scheme of things isn't going to make a difference, but it's an important training session to do. You certainly shouldn't miss the training session. You need to think about the training block as a whole. I think that's where people get
Mm.
lost. It gets lost in translation a little bit. Also, remember in powerlifting, we're trying to train you in a way to keep you fresh and optimize your training in a way that we can get you to the platform safely, healthy, and performing at your optimum so that you can, put up the best total. If we're fucking annihilating you in training over and over again, all the way to competition day comes, you're not going to perform. You just won't. We've seen this many times with people that we don't coach, even in our own gym who get external coaching or do their own coaching. They're constantly being battered in training, way too much training stress. And so by the time they get to the platform, they do 3 from 9 and they underperform and they wonder why. And the reason is they're fatigued. They're in a fatigue state for too long. And eventually that does catch up with you. And so that's why it's important to undulate training loads. And if I was to send you your planning, you could see your graph, you'll see that training loads, if we were to just average it out, you have this rising of your training loads, and then we'll have a decay where we wave down and then we come back up. We have this sort of decay before we start to bring you back up. And that's really just undulation of training load, which is important. I think, again, like I said before, if you divert your attention from weight on the bar, intensity focused, to the intensity focus being skill. And I think if you consider both aspects of a lift, how well do I perform the lift and how fucking strong I am at the lift, they have to work together. You can't just work on how strong I am, because if you don't work on how good I am, you never get stronger. And I think that's the important
Yeah.
part.
And I think that's probably where some of the listeners could actually rewind the podcast and listen to that twice, because
Yeah.
I see so many posts on social media where people their coach might have given them, say, a deload week, and they're griping about it
Oh,
because,
yeah.
look, we as
Why? Yeah, I know.
as when you so love your training and you so want to feel exhausted at the end of a session, it's really hard. And I know that's one of the things I think it's fair for me to say, because I think you've said it about yourself before, that you're more of a conservative coach. And this is one of the big lessons I've learnt from you, Dan, is to hold back a bit. And I know I give you a hard time sometimes about it, but it is difficult. And I think what you've
Mm,
just said and the explanation about the skill acquisition is really important.
yeah.
And I know that I need to remind myself of that as well quite regularly.
I mean, you've
But
experienced this yourself with the training, that when you're feeling better, when your stress and recovery scores are a lot higher, you perform better. Your life is better. You have less stress. You
yeah,
sleep better. Your moods are better. More energy. So it all kind of goes hand in hand. And if you just
yeah,
annihilate someone, look, honestly, it's actually easy to annihilate someone. I could absolutely annihilate you if I wanted to, right? That's actually
yeah,
easy. And coaches who do that, honestly, that's the easy way out. It's really difficult to optimize someone's training to a point where they feel fresh, yet they're still making consistent, regular progress over a long period of time. And I think that's a better way to go than completely
yeah,
devastating someone, right? Because that's easy to do.
yeah,
I could give you 10 sets of 10 squats at 80%. You'd be dead. You know what I mean?
yeah.
But we're not achieving
What
anything.
purpose would it serve?
Yeah,
Yeah,
what's the purpose? Just so I feel better as a coach because you're happy because you got annihilated, and then you can tell everyone I'm absolutely destroyed after each session. That's easy to do. It's smart. It's
yeah,
harder to be optimum. Yeah,
yeah.
being
I
optimum is
hear
actually
you.
important. Yeah, yeah.
So I've just got a couple more things before I move into the final bit, which I just want to talk a little bit about novice comps. But before I go there, um, just wanted to ask you a question. Do you train a reasonable number of women, say, that are over the age of 40?
Yes. Oh, depends on what you call a number of women. I've got a few women over 40. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah,
I mean,
because there's
obviously, I have you. I mean, you're an incredible lifter. I just had. I've got a spreadsheet here actually. I just had. Oh, let me just double check something. What's the
yeah.
question though? What's the question?
Well, it's a bit of a curly one, but this has gathered a lot of talk over the last couple of years. I've kind of got two two questions. Evidence shows that due to fluctuating progesterone and estrogen levels throughout a girl's cycle, our
Mm-hmm.
maximal strength, muscle mass, and performance obviously can vary over the month. And it's not just the muscle tissue, but also our moods, our energy levels, they're all impacted too. Now, some studies are showing that the follicular phase, like so days 1 to 14, we may have more strength and our moods are improving. Whereas the luteal phase, like day 15 to 28,
Yeah.
that's when we've got our PMS, water retention, moodiness. And so some coaches kind of decrease the loads in that phase. And I'm just wondering, Dan,
Yeah.
whether the menstrual cycle is something that you actually look at or not
Good.
at this point.
Good question. It's a good question. There's two parts to this question. The first is if you look at the programming we give you, for example, you're not doing 90%. You're not doing 80 to 90% all the time, right? So you might be doing work, we might have you working in 60 to 75%. So even if your performance was slightly affected by your menstrual cycle, you're still going to get through the session pretty straightforwardly. It's not like I've got you at 95% all the time and you hit that period of time where you have that decrease in performance and you're going to fail. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, as you know, each week we monitor those 10 markers in that stress and recovery survey. And a lot of women.
Well, it might be handy if you could just rattle them off for the listeners
Okay,
because
so
I know them, but
okay,
the
so
listeners
what
don't.
we do is, yeah, at the end of every training week, we ask our clients to fill out a questionnaire, which really we call it a stress and recovery survey. And really, what it is a wellness survey. So um, it serves as a survey that allows us to get an indication of your current state of wellness, but also serves as a purpose for a readiness survey. So how ready you are for the following week's training. So, for example, if I've got a woman who is going through this and really suffering, and it comes up in her stress and recovery survey. So some of the things that we look at are, we have markers on sleep, nutrition, energy, mood, or hydration. What else have we got in there? Stress, soreness. I think that pretty much covers the 10. And so what we look
Yeah.
for is we look for low scores that we feel may impact someone's training the following week or the actual training block. And we look for prolonged um, deviations in scores as well. All right. So if I see someone's having very low scores, which would mean very bad on a particular marker for an extended period of time, then it might mean we have to obviously we start asking questions, which we would do before that anyway. But it also might mean that we have to make some adjustments to training. All right. Now that could also happen week to week. So for example, with what you're talking about, if I've got someone doing their wellness survey and they start giving some low scores, and you also put a big description of what's going on. And if someone's really struggling, for example, with this, I might suggest they knock off some percentage points during the week in training.
Hmm.
It doesn't always happen because what we normally find is because our training is done in a way where you're not always working to like 100% stress. There's always headroom in your training. Does that make sense? So, for example, if I'm
Yeah.
giving you something that normally you'd be doing like at 6, okay, maybe if you were suffering a bit, it'd be an at 7 or 7.5. No big deal. Do you
Yeah.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas if I was
Yeah.
giving you 90% stress every session, then when you had that issue, like it would be an issue because there's no headroom.
Hmm.
You know, obviously as we get closer to competition and those percentages start to creep up, and as you know, I normally deal with that on a week by week basis anyway. You know, I'll pick numbers week.
Yeah.
I do have a plan, but we adjust them week to week if need be, and that's normally where we would make those changes based on those particular circumstances. In all fairness, in honesty, most of the women that we have don't struggle that much with this. They're actually pretty good. Some of them struggle a bit more, but most of the girls, I actually don't hear boo about their menstrual cycle because it just doesn't affect them, or it doesn't affect them enough. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting because I've noticed a marked um, increase in conversation about periods in the last 2 or 3 years of my training, markedly.
Yeah.
I don't know whether there's just more comfort in being able to talk about it,
Mm.
um, but yeah, it's and certainly there's a lot more articles, and even in one of the
Yeah.
courses that I'm doing by Girls Gone Strong, it is a massive topic.
Oh, it's
So
huge. Yeah.
just want to
And people are
yeah,
more
just want
comfortable talking about it now. Look, I'm also a male, so some women may feel awkward talking to me, but I try and encourage everyone. We try and encourage everyone to just tell us everything we need to know so that we can do the best job for you. And if that includes, Dan, I've got my period. I don't, this next week might feel like shit. At least I know what's going on. And in that case, I might say
yeah,
something like, if you are feeling it too much, just knock 10 or 15% off the bar and just make sure you get, your
yeah,
5.5 out or whatever the case may be. That's the
yeah,
best way to deal with that, to be honest. Um,
yeah,
because it can be a bit ad hoc. Sometimes a woman has a really bad month, and then the next cycle they're fine.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
undulating, right? And so
yeah,
I get it all the time. I'll have I'll do a session review. A girl will do their squats or their deadlifts or some shit, and they'll say they'll rate their squat at 8 or something, RP8, and then they'll say, had my period, didn't it felt like shit or something, you know what I mean? But they still got through
yeah,
the session because, again,
yeah,
we've got them working in ranges where there's some headroom to allow for that type of thing. Obviously, in comp prep, it's different. We're working at high percentages, we make adjustments. It's a little bit different. It's a good question.
yeah.
It's actually a good question. And look, like I said, maybe because I'm male, we might find that some women feel a bit awkward talking to us about those particular things, unless it's really affecting their training. Then they will probably bring it up.
Well, quite frankly, Dan, I think that you would be kind of lucky because you're really approachable, and I don't think you'd bat an eyelid if it was to be brought up in
It doesn't bother me.
conversation.
No,
Um, no, no. I just ask it for the listeners because on a personal level, it's never bothered me, and you know,
mm,
it just doesn't seem to affect me. But because it affects so many others, it
it
was a
does.
worthwhile question. Um, so just moving on to I'm aware of your time.
No, don't stress.
Just wanted to ask a few little questions about competing in powerlifting. I think powerlifting can be seen as a little intimidating, and some people might not know if they can lift enough to compete.
Hmm.
So, what what is there a minimum that you need to be able to lift? And what would you say to those people that are kind of sitting on the fence? They're secretly really wanting to do a comp, but they're really nervous.
Yeah,
What would you say to them?
we actually did a whole podcast about this.
Oh,
We actually have a podcast. Yeah, we actually have a podcast on competing in novice powerlifting, and we cover this exact thing. But we'll go through it now. It's actually an important one because some people do feel intimidated, or they're not good enough. Or you also have the flip side of the coin, the I'm not going to compete until I win mentality. Um,
yeah,
let's talk about the first one first. How strong do I have to be? I don't think I'm strong enough. The reality is, at the end of the day, what the beauty about powerlifting is, you're actually, in a way, competing against yourself. You know, you do your first competition, you total 300 kilos. You might compete 6 months later. Your aim is to beat 300 kilos. Who cares about what everyone else is doing? Leave that for the elite lifters, the guys that have been in the sport for 10 years that take the shit really, really seriously. Does that make sense? Um,
Yep.
One day you might get to that point where it does matter, the competition side matters, but outside of that, use it as a mechanism for your own personal growth and development. It doesn't. The answer to the question, how strong do you have to be? If you can squat the bar, you can get on the platform. Don't be embarrassed. In fact, I love it when I see someone go on the platform and all they're squatting is the bar because that shows courage. What I don't like is when I hear I'm not going to compete until I'm strong enough. Absolutely does my head in because those people never get on the platform because they're never going to be strong enough. They think that everyone else is
Yeah.
sitting around waiting for them to catch up. It doesn't happen that way. The best way to progress is to get on the platform as early as possible. So, in fact, when we sign coaching clients up, the first question we ask is, which comp are we doing?
Oh,
What are we doing?
okay.
Because Paul and I, as powerlifting coaches, right now, because of how things have grown, unless someone is actually earmarking a comp, I don't take them on board. I don't take them. I'm a powerlifting coach.
Right.
I'm not here to just fucking coach random shit. I'm here to take someone to the platform and beyond. Although we do have Elliot now, which is fantastic. So a lot of our new lifters that are coming through that we're developing, a lot of them start with Elliot, which is fantastic because he can develop them. And Paul and I normally look after your intermediate, your advanced, your elite lifters. Because at the end of the
Can
day,
can I can I interject on what you said about uh I don't want to compete until I'm good enough to win? Dan, in bodybuilding, the number of men that I've had a conversation with that said, "Oh, I'm just waiting until I'm big enough,"
oh yeah,
and I just think to myself, right, you're never going to compete
never.
because
They're never going to do
they're
it.
never going to be big enough.
They never
So
do it.
I have to have a giggle when I hear you say that because it's like that's exactly the same with bodybuilding.
Yeah, I mean,
It's like
I have a great story
I think
actually.
you've got to get in there and just give it a go.
The only way to progress is to step outside your comfort zone, right? And the only way to do that is to get on the platform. I had a guy come in
Yeah,
a couple of months ago. He weighed about 100 kilos. He was relatively strong, squatted about 200. He was okay. Um, had the conversation of competing and all that type of thing, and took him out to the gym for a walk around. Seemed like an okay guy. He gets to the record ball, right? He looks at the 100 kilo class. Our 100 kilo class is right Sagor. He's the GPC world record holder in the 100 kilos. He has the all-time Australian 100 kilo record, which actually beats the 110 kilo all-time record, by the way. No one ain't beating him. You know what he said to me? He said, "How long do you think it'll take for you to get me to beat this guy?" And I said, "Never." I said, "It's not going to happen, man." As soon as someone asks me that question, I know straight away that they're in it for the short term. He'll never get there because they're always thinking about like, how do I beat the guy that's like right at the top that's been doing it for 20 years? Like, dude, what do you think we're all trying to do? And we've been doing it for 10 or 15 years. And it's a really annoying position to get in because I just eye roll. I'm like, here we go, here's another dickhead.
yeah,
Because people are thinking about the short term. Like obviously when I say never, I'm being sarcastic. He might, you never know. But it's the mentality. The mentality is insane. It drives me crazy. We see it all the
mm,
time, right? Like you said, you see it in bodybuilding. So to answer everyone's question, if you're thinking about competing in powerlifting, the best time to do it is now.
yeah,
Find a gym that's around you that has good meets, and just sign up. You've got nothing to lose. A novice competition, there's no winners. It's really about getting experience on the platform. And I know it's cliche, but everyone's a winner. Not that everyone gets a medal, which I hope not, but everyone's a winner because you're all experiencing powerlifting together. Yeah, and the sport wins at the end of
yeah,
the day.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. And uh, just you just be brief if you like, but with the three lifts on a novice comp day, what would be the usual reasons for uh, red lights? Like,
yeah, red lights.
where do novices usually muck up?
Good question. There's also, we covered this in the podcast as well, and there's even an article that we wrote that gets sent email to lifters when they sign up for novice comps that has this information. But really, the few areas that people really mess up the most is missing the referee calls. So not waiting for the head referee to signal before they start moving. We don't really have time to go into all of them, but if you were to go to the
Yep.
GPC Australia website, download the rule book, it's free, you can read the rule book. So missing the referee commands, because you have to wait for the referee.
Yep.
Hitting depth on the squat, so failing to have the surface of your quad below the top of the knee, that's the big one, not deep enough. With the bench press, again, obviously not failing, beating the referee commands. And I guess the other one on the bench is ass coming up off the bench. So your ass can't come up off the bench, right? So that's probably another big one for novice lifters. And with the deadlift, the big one is not locking out your knees, because you have to have knees and hips locked out at the end of the lift. And it's we call it soft knees, where someone's not locking out their knees. They're sort of the biggest ones that people mess up.
Great. Cool. And if you were just starting out in your journey to a novice comp and you're on a bit of a budget, what's the one thing that you would spend your money on as a must-have purchase in terms of equipment?
Look, as long as you've got bar and weight and a bench press, that's all you need.
No, I mean,
personal equipment.
Not so much personal equipment.
Like a wrist wrap or a knee sleeve or something like that. Well, most people have all that shit these days anyway, don't they? But if you were really on a tight budget with none of that stuff, I'd probably get a belt. Yeah. Because the belt is going to help you increase intra-abdominal pressure, more stable, more facilitation of transfer of force. Yeah. Belt would be the way to go.
Yeah. All right, getting close to wrapping up, but I was going to mention, so you obviously do a lot of online coaching, and like it took me quite a while to figure out, who I wanted to be coached by, and I went over to Perth, where you are, and did an advanced workshop in powerlifting, and I went with a girlfriend, Michelle Fernick, and we absolutely loved it. And on the aeroplane on the way home, I went, I want him as my coach.
I coach Michelle. I still coach her.
Yes. Can you just explain a little bit about the software that we use? And do you think that you can be just as successful without having access to you and doing it online? What are your thoughts on that?
Can someone be successful as a lifter without having a coach? Is that the question?
No, by being online as opposed to being in person with you.
As in, can a coach be successful doing it online only?
No, can the client be successful using online coaching?
Oh, of course. I mean, we've been doing this for, honestly, Paul and I have probably been doing this longer than most in terms of powerlifting. We've had online clients now for 6 years. And it's really only the last few years that it's become a buzz thing, right? Absolutely, of course. Look, people do learn in different ways. So some people can take some feedback either by video or just obviously me typing it out, and able to understand what I'm saying, and incorporate those changes into their lifting. Also, it comes down to the coach, how well a coach can explain something. And also in how many different ways, because you explain it in one way, client doesn't get it, have to explain it a different way. You have to find the right way for that client to understand. So we use a combination, and as you know, of photos, so some of our own coaching content, and us obviously typing stuff down and explaining stuff. So you've kind of got a visual, and so you kind of have the mix of both. But some people are tactile learners, so you have to have them in front of you. You have to be able to touch them, put them in position, have that more interaction. And so it kind of depends on the kind of learner you are. Now, obviously, if you're, like for yourself, you're over there. So obviously being tactile and being person to person is very difficult, but you're okay with being online. We're able to get the job done. if you're in Perth, sometimes our clients also book one-on-one coaching sessions where we're able to be with them on the floor and take them through the lifts in a more granular way. And obviously, we can get a lot more done in an hour on the floor than we can online in an online scenario when I'm watching one video, one set. And it's kind of like a walkie-talkie, right? You pick up a walkie-talkie, you press the button, and you start talking. The other person can't talk while you're talking. It's a one-way communication.
Mhm.
That's kind of like what online is like. Whereas in person, it's kind of like your mobile phone. You can both talk at the same time, have this interaction, you know.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so having that interaction in that format, person to person, can really speed up progress because I'm able to get someone in position really quickly without having to explain it, week in, week out until they get it right. Um, but to answer your question, you can do well online. Obviously, there are many online coaches. They all have different styles, different mechanisms in which way operate and work with clients. We've been doing this a long time, so we've had a long time to refine and understand the needs of the clients, especially in situations where they are quite remote. So we have a lot of little tools and stuff that we have. And now, as you know, we use TrueCoach to deliver programming and questionnaires and content, which makes it really easy instead of the old Google Sheet or the spreadsheet, which makes it really cumbersome. So it's a lot more efficient now. It's a lot nicer. So everything gets delivered to your phone, really packaged up quite nicely, to be
Yeah.
honest. Yeah. But yeah, absolutely you can. And I mean, you do some online coaching, Ing, I'm sure. Obviously, we do some online coaching. If you want Ing to coach you, you can contact her. If you want me to coach you, you can contact us. It's pretty straightforward. Yeah.
Ab- Absolutely. What's your favorite lift, Dan?
A squat is my favorite lift,
Scott?
which kind of sucks because I
So,
can't squat at the moment.
oh no.
Deadlift would be my. Actually, it's in the lifts in their order are my preference: squat, bench, and deadlift.
Oh, okay.
Paul and I have never really been big deadlifters, and I guess it's because we've never really had high frequency or high training loads with the deadlift, and that's really initially due to fear, right? Fear of hurting yourself, that sort of thing. Now I can
Mhm.
increase the frequency and load on my deadlifts a bit more, so I like it a little bit more. We were always squatters. We were soccer players, so we had the bigger legs, and so naturally just felt ourselves to be squatters. I've squatted more than I've deadlifted. You know what I mean? So,
Right.
which is not common for a guy in my sort of weight range. Normally, you'll find that they
Yeah.
deadlift a lot more. As you get into the heavier weight classes, you do find that the squat does start to overpower the deadlift, and that's really just due to leverage and body weight. So yeah. But hopefully, I can get my squat back.
I hope you do too. Now, if we don't find you in a gym, where might we find Dan Rucci? Where else do you hang out, Dan?
Uh,
I hear you play a bit of snooker. Is that
Oh,
correct?
I used to play a lot of snooker. When I was younger, I
Yeah.
played. Took it pretty seriously. I trained like 6 hours a day. Um, and
Oh,
and
that's pretty serious.
and to be honest, and I'll tell you what I tell everyone else. If I could actually choose my profession, like if I could just click my fingers and say that's what I wanted to do, I would actually be a professional snooker player.
Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah. I'm
I'll,
not saying I
I'll
don't love
never.
what I do. Of course, I love what I do. But it was always my passion from when I was sort of late teens, and I kept playing. I sort of stopped playing seriously, sort of halfway through uni when shit got really serious at uni, and then I started working, and it was just too hard to maintain 6 hours a day of practice. And I've been
Mm,
on and off the game since then. I did start playing a couple of years ago, but then again things got really hectic here, so naturally that's gonna take a backseat. But yeah, I actually have a snooker coach.
yeah.
He's in. I actually have I
Oh,
actually have an online snooker coach. He's in the UK.
wow.
Yeah,
Well, there you go.
mm,
There's something I didn't know.
there you go.
Okay, so for anyone that's listening, I just wanted to say that I've been to Perth and over to Rucci's gym, I think 4 times. If you're ever in Perth, you have to go to Rucci's gym. What's the name of the suburb, Dan?
Sorry.
The name of the suburb in Perth that you're
We
in?
are in Malaga, so
Malaga.
we're about
Malaga.
15
Yeah.
minutes from the CBD.
Yeah. I mean, you couldn't want for a better gym. You can always say that you listen to Ingrid's podcast, and there you are, and Dan and Paul will look after you.
100%.
And you can find Dan on Instagram at Rucci's Gym.
Yeah, so
Um, any
Rucci's Gym is our
any other
Instagram,
details?
or you'll find us. Or
Yeah,
I think I'm Dan underscore Rucci's underscore Gym. Um, yeah, easy. I'm easy to find. If you search for Dan Rucci, I'm
yeah,
pretty sure you'll
and
find me.
all right. So, just to wrap up, look, Dan, thank you so much for spending the
That
time
was
today.
fun.
I really appreciate it. I think you've given, I think you've given the listeners quite a bit to think about, and there was some really good tips in there. And
I hope
yeah,
I can help.
can't wait until the borders. I can't wait till the borders are open and I can get
Oh
myself back
man,
over to have
I feel
some
sorry with you.
sessions with
I
you
feel sorry for
again.
you guys. I've got Michelle over there as well, and she's just recently got some equipment delivered to her so we can start her training again. But it's crazy,
Oh
man.
gosh,
I mean, you're lucky in a way. You've got all that equipment
yeah.
like at you, pretty much at your house. Um,
Yes, I am lucky.
oh,
Yeah, but
man,
at least you're not wearing mouth masks and all the rest of it either. But
yeah, true,
anyway,
true.
all right, Dan. Thanks again, and
My pleasure.
we'll speak soon.
My
All right,
pleasure. That was
thanks a
good
lot.
fun. See ya.